looking like this? Tell me, am I looking like this? No, not at all.
Hey, what's going on, you beautiful people? My name's Tie-Dye. I hope you guys had a pretty awesome day today. My day's been pretty awesome so far. So in today's video, I'm going to finally get around to doing a tutorial on UV mapping, what it is, why it's important, and most importantly, how do you do UV mapping? So we're going to be using Maya 2017. This is the newest version of Maya, so this is what we're going to be using to sort of go over UVs. You can be using pretty much any version, I believe, plus it's free to download, so you might as well just get the latest and greatest version of it. I've been using 2017 recently, been using 2016 for the past year, but 2017 has been really nice. I like the updates that they've added to that, and if you haven't tried it out, I'd highly recommend doing so. But before we dive into it, I do have a question. For my next tutorial, would you guys rather see professional rendering techniques, or would you rather get an introduction into animation? You know, just leave a comment down below which one would you rather see. Also, while you're down there, drop a like and subscribe if you're new here, guys. But we're going to be diving into UVs, assuming that you guys don't know what they are whatsoever. So essentially what UVs are, and it's kind of hard to explain, but you have to think of it as if you're taking 3D geometry and flattening it into a 2D workspace. Now, a great example of that is this door here. So as you can see, this is a 3D door. If I actually open up the scene in the Unreal Engine, as you can see, this is a fully done door that I've actually textured and all that. Fully completed. There's colors on it, there's shine where there should be. It's not perfect by any means, as you can see there, but this is the fully finished door, and this is how it looked in Maya before I could get to any of that. And as you can see here, we have this sort of interesting looking pattern and layout, and some of these shapes in here do look familiar. So if you see, for example, this sort of shape here, this corresponds with the metal holding part of the door there. And if we sort of look over here, these rings look awfully familiar to these rings here, and similar to like these stone pieces here look like these ones, and so on. So this is an unfolded version of this door. Same with, like, if you look at this pillar, this is an unfolded version of that. It's just harder to sort of see that, and the barrel, and let's say the carpet as well. So essentially, you're taking 3D geometry and flattening it out into a 2D workspace. And the reason we do that is because we can export 3D models. But what we can't actually do is we cannot export 3D texture files necessarily. So what we have to do is flatten them into this space where then we can draw onto it and add our textures. And not only textures, but stuff like specular maps and opacity maps and normal maps and all this different stuff. Because technically what you're doing is when you're moving something from, say, Maya to Substance Painter, or Substance Painter to the Unreal Engine, the way that you transfer texture data and how reflective something is and all that is through actual image files, and the image files are mapped to here. So say something was super reflective, and my reflective map, I would have it pretty much all white, and then the white corresponds with how reflective something is in the game engine. So that's how you sort of transfer that information. And then if you just want color, essentially where you're coloring in something, that's where the color is going to be. So before you do any of that, you do have to flatten your objects into an actual 3D working space. So I can give you a few examples as to what that looks like. So if I dive over into Google Images, a great way to sort of picture it is like origami. So this is apparently a celestial origami pony template, so we're just going to go with that for now. As you can see, this is a 2D object, but we know it can be folded into a 3D object, and it's sort of like that, but the reverse with UV mapping. It's a 3D object that we're going to have to turn into a 2D object, and obviously with this, it would be a lot easier to draw onto it when it's 2D and not 3D, so the same sort of principles apply. So let's dive into some real actual examples. So this is a very, very familiar character. This is Ziggs from League of Legends. I'm sure a lot of you guys recognize him. So on the right side, this is his full in-game model, and on the left side, this is his UV maps. And as you can see, it's very, very tightly packed in here, but there's components that we can recognize. For example, at the bottom here, this is his hand, this is his glove, this is the bomb on his back, his face. Obviously, the rest of this is kind of harder to tell. I assume this is probably the band on his helmet there, and the rest of it, obviously, with the wireframe on it, is a bit more difficult to actually understand. But you can see that this is sort of an unfolded version of it. Everything's kind of stretched and looks weird. For example, this sphere on his back sort of looks more like an egg shape, and his hands are kind of, you know, a little bit more blocked out, and everything looks a little bit different. This is a round 3D shape, this is a 2D shape, so essentially it's flattening everything out into 2D space. And obviously this is just the color map. Actually, with League of Legends, there is just a color map, so luckily it's easier to explain that way. And same with this example here. So we have this character here, and we actually have two different maps, which is a little bit more uncommon, so this might not be the best example. But as you can see, we have his boot here, we have his arm, I'm assuming that's his arm and that's his leg, based on the tattoos. We sort of have his chest piece, his pants, and his head up here as well. And as you can see, it's just half of it, and we're going to dive into why exactly you might only want to do just half of something for a UV example. And as you can see with this image here, once you're fully done, you should be able to technically apply any texture, and it's going to sort of be perfectly distributed. Because say you put on a random texture, like a grass texture onto the ground, if it's not UV mapped, it's just going to be completely random and sporadic as to how it's done. So we're going to be sort of teaching you the basics, or I'm going to be teaching you the basics of how to actually do this from scratch, assuming that you don't know a whole lot about UV mapping. And obviously this is a bit more complex stuff, but we're going to dive into some very simple stuff, and it can be applied to this in many different ways. So this is a bit more of an extreme example. Obviously I wouldn't expect you guys to dive into something like this, so we're going to start with a new file, and we're going to start doing stuff very simply. And let me just teach you where the UV tab actually is. So if you're in the modeling section, go to the drop down menu and go to modeling. Under UV, we're going to use something called the UV editor, and this is going to open up a new window that essentially has all of our awesome UV tools and tips and stuff like that here that we can sort of go off of. And yeah, essentially this is going to be our bread and butter for UV, so it's very helpful to have two monitors for this. Of course, I'm going to drag it over and show it to you guys when I am using it, but for now I'm just going to move it over here, and we're going to drop in some objects to play with. So first of all, we're going to use a cube. A cube is probably the easiest way to sort of understand UV mapping, and the reason that is because I'm sure a lot of you guys in school, and probably around like grade 4 or so, did things such as folding paper objects into 3D meshes, or not really 3D mesh, but sort of taking a paper cutout of something and folding it into a shape, sort of like in geometry class. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And this is probably what it looks like. This sort of is like a how you'd cut out a normal box and fold it together. So essentially, this right here, all these faces are these faces here. So if I go to face, this face corresponds with that, this face is that one there, and so on, and then it wraps around the top and the bottom. And so if I apply a texture, it should be pretty damn good, because these squares are doing a fantastic job of representing what these squares look like. They're pretty spot on, because these are perfect squares and these are perfect squares. So the way that we check this out, like I said, is by using a checker texture. So what I'm going to do is apply a checker texture by holding right click, going to assign favorite material, and I'm just going to use a Lambert, just keep it simple. Under our Lambert settings, I'm going to go to color, and we're going to put on this checker texture, which is probably the reason it's there, is to check UVs. And then I'm going to turn my texture options on here, just with this icon there. And as you can see, these squares are pretty spot on. If there was some distortion, these squares wouldn't be squares, because it just wouldn't be accurately mapping it. So if I sort of start messing with these UVs, and you get some different options here. When you hold right click, you get some different options such as shell and UV. So say I take some of these UVs here, and apparently these two correspond with these two UVs here. If I start messing up this shell that we would normally draw on, and say I move these over, as you can see, it is no longer an accurate representation. So since this is skewed over, the image that we're sort of putting onto this is also skewed over. So say we drew a crate texture for this. Say we had some wooden textures, and we imported it on top of this, and we want it to look like a crate for a game. If we had this there, it would be completely distorted. It would be very inaccurate. And if I undo this and sort of make it a perfect box once again, it's going to be perfectly accurate. And there's like little tweaks that you can do. So if I move just one, it'll be a little inaccurate on that side. And obviously, it is pretty much as accurate as it can get right now, but we can do a better job. So another thing that you want to keep in mind when using the UV editor is you want to keep all of your faces and everything that you're UVing into this top right quadrant here. The reason for that, I'm not 100% sure, but the pretty much essentials of UVing happens in the top right. You want to keep everything here in the top right. And what you want to do is sort of maximize how much space you have. So as you can see, we're pretty much touching the bottom and the top. We're using about as much space as we possibly can. And this is how much texture space we have. So say, if I were to blow this up quite a bit in proportion and sort of make this a lot bigger, as you can see, the checker is starting to repeat, which means we have a lot more texture space to work with when we make this a lot bigger, but we're outside of this scale. But if I bring it back in, we have a lot less texture space to work with, but we actually have, we're within the quadrant essentially. So that's kind of what we want to do. We want to maximize our space in the quadrant while staying in the quadrant. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Typically with a box, this is pretty spot on. There's not a lot extra you'd actually have to do here, but I think this is looking good. So just sort of imagine, because with game textures, you sort of have to make everything square resolution. So say 1024 by 1024 or 2048 by 2048, 1 and 2K respectively. You sort of need to make everything a square texture. That's kind of why you want to keep it in there. But imagine we exported these UV coordinates into Photoshop, right? There's all this unused space. These are all pixels that could be used as a texture for this that aren't being used. So say we have 1024 by 1024, we're approximately missing out on half of those. So 512 pixels, or maybe even more at this point, to be perfectly honest, aren't being used, but we're actually sort of having that information into our game. It's making our game do more, or our movie do more, or whatnot. So it's taking more time to render, but we're not using as much as we possibly could. So you want to maximize as much space as you possibly can in this window. So there's a bunch of different tools to do. Like I said, with a cube, usually you wouldn't really bother with that simply because this is as good as it gets in most cases, but we can do better. So say I go into my edge options and I selected this edge because I want to cut it along this edge so that I can take these pieces and sort of rotate them and blow it up a little bit bigger. So if you want to cut something, what you can do is sort of click the edge you want to cut, and I want to cut along this edge, and go to polygons, cut UV edges. And now if I go into my shell options, we have two different shells here, and I can take this one and using this rotation tool, rotate it, and now we have, as you can see, a lot more space to deal with here in this UV editor. I can make this bigger, and we're still within the quadrant itself. So that's a cool way to do that. It's sort of like a big jigsaw puzzle. You want to use as much space as possible using these different tricks, and now everything's in the square but bigger. But say you didn't want to do that. Say you wanted to sort of actually stitch things together. So let's go back a little bit to where this is rotated, and say I want to stitch these back together. So what I can do now is if I click this edge, as you can see, I just clicked one edge, but it selected both of them, because technically, even though these are two different UV shells, and shells is just a collection of polygons, they are sharing the same edge here. This is the same edge in our actual geometry. So if I select that, what I can do is do the opposite of a cut, which is a sew, and if I click move and sew UV edges, it's going to sew it back down. But for the sake of this, and we want to use as much texture space as possible, once again, I'm going to select that, cut the UV edge, select our shell, rotate it, and now we can use much more of the space. And let me just select both of these here. And now we sort of have a maximized UV space cube. And we can even, if we want to, use a tool called Layout under the polygon options. It's just Layout here. I believe it's in 2016 as well. There might just be some new options. That's why it's green here. But you click that and it'll make it as big as it possibly can. And that's a great way to maximize your space as well. So I just sort of cut that there, moved it there. But that's how you cut, and that's how you sew UV edges, just to keep shells into a organized manner. Now, a cube is a bit of an interesting way to teach people because it is already perfectly done pretty much. So let's move on to something a little bit different, like a cylinder, which isn't actually perfectly done. And if you guys don't mind, I'm just going to take a quick drink because I have a bit of a cough here, so hopefully you guys don't mind. Sorry about that. So now we're going to move on to a cylinder. And if we look at the UVs for the cylinder, they appear that they would be perfect because there are circles here, which correspond with the circle on the top and the bottom, and we do have all these different lines here that correspond with perhaps the lines going around the cylinder. But if we do apply our checker texture, which is the way that you want to check pretty much everything, we're going to soon see that this is actually a horribly done UV job. Well, it's not like horrible. You're going to see a lot worse ones, especially when you're working with bigger scenes. But it can be definitely a lot better, because if we put this in here, as you can see, these are not cubes going around. These are most definitely rectangles, but we do have some weird stuff going on. And even on the top and the bottom, they're sort of distorted as well. These aren't perfect lines by any means. So it is very interesting in that sense as to how that happened. So what we're going to do is going to do a manual UV job. And this is essentially what you're going to be doing for everything. You're going to be manually making your UVs. So what I'm going to do is select the top faces and the bottom faces, and we're going to be using a method called UV planers. So UV planers is essentially projecting your 3D geometry into 2D space depending on the X, the Y, or the Z axis. And it'll be easier to understand once I sort of show it to you guys. So I'm going to select all the faces on the top and the bottom using my face selection options. So as you can see, I selected all the ones on the top and the bottom. And under UV options, under planar, I'm going to click more options by clicking the square. If I select Y, and I want to do Y because I want to project it from 2D from above or below using our Y axis, because I want it to look like this from directly above or directly below, and I hit apply, as you can see, now they are perfect squares from the top and the bottom. And if we go into our UV editor, it is a perfect circle. We actually have them directly on top of each other as well. So see that? They're directly on top of each other. If I select both of them, I can move them over. And I'll talk about that more in a second, but now let's talk about how we would actually get this side part done, because it is a little bit different. So let's look on it from dead on, and we're going to do a UV projection in the Z axis. So I'm going to select the faces that we want to project and go to UV, planar, just like before, and then this time I'm going to select Z, so we're doing it from head on. And as you can see, for the most part, it looks like it's done perfectly. It looks like we have everything done perfectly, but if we rotate, there's some serious distortion here. These are not cubes. This is being stretched quite a bit, but then we have it perfect on the back. And that's because the front and the back are overlapping, so it sort of gives the illusion of perfect texture UVing, and it's sort of displayed perfectly. It looks like that, but on the side, it's not so much. And that's because we displayed it from what we saw in the Z-axis. And this is exactly what we're seeing. We have these faces that are sort of squished here, and then we can't even see these side faces at all in the Z-axis when we're looking dead on. So what we're going to have to actually do is cut it and unfold it. So we have to think of this as, a great way to sort of think of this, is if you have a piece of paper and you roll it into a tube. Now, if you roll it into a tube, it's going to look something like this. And if you look at it head on, it's going to be, you know, somewhat like this shape. It's going to sort of look like a rectangle to some degree, but you won't be able to see the sides. Now what you can actually do is sort of cut that paper tube and unfold it, and that way you're going to see all of the paper. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to cut this and unfold it. So similar to how we cut before, we're going to be doing that again. So I'm going to select an edge on the back just to sort of hide the seam here. And as you can see, we selected it there as well in the viewport, which is, it looks like it's in the front, but it's just because the front and the back are perfectly on top of each other. I'm going to go to polygons, cut UV edges. So now that it is sliced, it's like if we took that paper tube and sliced it down the back. And if I select all of our UVs here, just by right clicking, going to UV and selecting all of them, I'm going to go to our unfold option. So there's two ways to get to that. This icon here, you can right click on it, or you can go to polygons and unfold, and I'm going to click on the more options menu. And by default, you're going to be under unfold 3D, but I want to go over to legacy. And now we know from the vertical axis that this is perfect. You know, from the y-axis and vertically going up and down, the cubes are perfect. It's just in the x-axis and the z-axis, it's kind of distorted there. So technically that means horizontally, there's some disturbance going on there. I'm a little bit tired. Sorry for slurring my words here, guys. Sorry. Horizontally, there is some disturbance. So what we want to do is go to unfold constraint in just horizontal, because we just want to unfold it horizontally. So if we hit apply, as you can see now, it is perfect all the way around. If we go to our UV options, we're going to see why. It's because we took that sort of paper cone, we cut it down the back, and we unfolded it all the way around. So we have our entire piece of paper there. And now essentially it is perfectly done. But if we go to the back, let's see. Say if I make this a little bit smaller. Where was that seam? On the back, there should be a bit of a seam. Yeah, there it is. So as you can see on the back, there is actually a seam. So we're going to be able to see where the UV and the texture is cut and where it's meeting. But that's why you want to sort of hide that and put it somewhere on the back there. And technically, if we had a texture that we wanted it to be, say, a barrel or something like that, you wouldn't even see that if you textured it right. So that is actually perfectly fine. And it's all good there. And as you can see, the cubes themselves are a little bit of a different shape since I sort of changed it. Another thing that you want to do is most definitely make sure that these are all the same size, because you want everything to sort of have the same amount of resolution. If this is taking up a certain amount of pixels, this should also be taking up in perspective the same amount of pixels, just so that everything sort of, nothing looks more detailed than something else. And I think that's maybe why, in this example here, why the face had a different UV sheet is probably because it wants more detail in the face, because that's more of a feature that you're going to be looking at on a character than the body, so they made a whole separate UV sheet just for the face. That probably makes sense. So you just don't want to keep everything in perspective and keep everything somewhat the same size and shape there. So now let's talk about overlapping. So as you can see, we have a shell on the top and the bottom here. One there and one there, but for some reason we only have one displaying here, and that's because, like I said before, they're on top of each other. Now, it's interesting in the sense that, say we had an image here that, let's say this was a barrel, right? If we wanted the top of the barrel and the bottom of the barrel to look the exact same, we could just overlap similar looking parts like this. And technically they would end up looking the exact same because they're sharing the exact same texture space. They'd be overlapping over top of the exact same thing. For example, this face. This face here is symmetrical. So there's probably two UV sheets here, one for each side of the face, directly on top of each other. And the way that that works is they're both going to be going over top of this facial detail here and displaying the exact same thing, just perfectly symmetrical. And it's going to come across looking as if it's the exact same thing twice, but it's just mirrored over. So this is sort of the same idea here, but say you wanted something different on the top and the bottom, you would just move one out of the way and go from there. So it depends on if you want things to be the same. If you want things to be the same, you overlap. Otherwise, never overlap things. You should never, ever, ever overlap unless you want things to look the exact same. And even like little overlaps like this, should never ever happen. So once again, we can just sort of select these and see how it looks with a default layout option. I'm just going to apply that, and that's how it lays it out. Obviously, say like we have this extra space here, it is okay to technically move these and say blow them up a bit just to use a bit more texture space. I know you want to keep it as accurate as possible, but say like you want to have some extra detail on the top and the bottom, you can do that. Obviously, you can't blow this up unless you turn it sideways and sort of angle it a bit. Then you can blow it up maybe, and then you can hide the other objects around there. But for now, I think that looks about as good as that is going to get. So that's how you sort of cut something up and use planaring as well. And there's one last example that I want to teach you guys, and that is how you would do a symmetrical object like that face. So I'm actually going to delete this object completely, and let's just make a really weird shape. So let's just drop in a cube. I'm going to use some symmetry, so I'm going to go into our modeling toolkit here on the side. If you don't find it, it's this icon right up here. And I'm just going to put on basic symmetry, so symmetry object X. Let's see, let's just make something really random. Let's see, so I'm just going to extrude in random ways, maybe bring that up, and then bring that down. So just so we have a perfectly symmetrical object. And just to keep it easier for us, what I'm going to do is going to cut a line down the middle just by holding control with my multi-cut tool and slicing that directly down the middle. So what we can do actually, instead of UVing both sides and having extra spots in our UV editor that are going to be taking up extra space, essentially is what I'm trying to say. It would be taking up twice as much space if we UV'd both sides, but if we want it to be the exact same on both sides, what we can actually do is just UV one side, flip it over, and have it share the same UV space. And also, as you can see, this is a great example to show. If you remember back to our cube, this is how it looked by default, and even after making all of these changes, it's pretty much the exact same minus one little line in the middle. So this is another example as to why you should use your UV tools at the very end. Don't UV anything until you're done your entire mesh or your scene or your character. So UVing is definitely one of the final steps when it comes to modeling, and you definitely want to leave that to the very end. So what I'm going to do here is, okay, my symmetry is off. I'm just going to delete half of these, and what we're going to do here is apply our texture. And you're going to see very, very soon just how terribly it comes out. So this is how it looks by default. So this is how our UV map here displays textures, and this is why UV mapping is so important. So, where do we begin with something like this? Let's start with just using planars. So in the y-axis, we're going to be wanting to use these because they're going up and down. Same with down here. So I'm going to select those faces, go to UV, planar, and Y. And as you can see, they're distorted, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then these faces that are facing the z-axis, we're just doing this one axis at a time. And we know they're facing the z-axis because of this little indicator here on the bottom. I'm going off of that. And we're going to planar those in z. And once again, those are distorted, but we can face that at a later time. And then this one is pretty spot on, but just to make sure, we're going to planar that in the x-axis. So now we have this sort of cluster of objects here, which is not perfect. So I'm going to select them all and just do a layout real quick, just to sort of get our bearings on all the objects. And let's see, I'm just going to sort of move these apart a little bit, just so we can see what we're dealing with here. And I'm going to make them a bit bigger, just so we can see it a little bit better in comparison to the cubes on the actual object. So now I'm going to take this one shell at a time. So let's take each shell, sorry. And as you can see, if I sort of stretch it in this direction, it's going to become more cube-like because it's more accurately representing what this shape looks like from the y-axis. So you can do that. You can guess that way, or you can just go to UVs and select all your UVs and get it perfectly done by going to your layout options and, your unfold options, and go to horizontal and apply, and it'll do it perfectly for you that way. And we're just going to do that for each of these. I'm assuming this is the next one on the bottom here. And I'm just doing horizontal just because I know horizontal is the only way that it needs to be done right now. And let's go back down to horizontal, apply. That did not turn out the way I wanted it to for some reason. Let's try that again. And let's see. Alright, so this is acting a little bit interesting on this one. Let's see if we can manually do it. So I'm just going to stretch it out until I see for the most part, cubes. And I'm just going to grab some edges and see if I can make it cubes along every single part of it. Or squares, sorry, just to match the checker texture. And let's just grab these UVs here. And that's looking pretty spot on there. Also, UVs, you can sort of think of that as the vertices of the UV editor. So if that's how you like to work, that is definitely a great way to do so. And it's great to just sort of like keep your finished ones over to the side while you're working on the rest. So now I'm going to go over to this shell. And as you can see, if you're looking at it from the axis, it should be an accurate representation. So this here is a lot longer than this. This is definitely a lot shorter and crunched down. So I'm going to select all of these UVs. And let's try this again. Maybe I messed with the setting that I didn't see. That's definitely got to be it. Maximum iterations, stopping threshold. Let's see. You usually have this around 5,000. Yeah, so you want to make your maximum iterations around 5,000 or so. It's going to make it look better. And that looks pretty spot on. And now let's try this one, which is on the other side. And we can unfold that as well on the horizontal axis. And then this one is already perfectly done just because it's a square. So now what you want to do is, like I said before, make sure all of the checkers are roughly the same size. So let's start with the top one just to give us sort of an indication. Let's make it about yay big for now. And it's just great to sort of make them all roughly the same. So you just want to make it so that they are using somewhat of the same texture space, just so that nothing has a lot more detail than something else, because it's very, very obvious when, say, something has a hell of a lot more texture space to use than another object, and it just sort of makes it look weird, because as you can see, there's a lot more checkers on this than anything else, and that is not okay. So now that we're going to finish up here, what we want to do is grab all our shells and fit it back into that top right quadrant as best as we can. So it's essentially like a little bit of a puzzle. And let's just try and make it as square shaped as possible. And let's just go with this for now. This is just an example simply because I don't want this tutorial to be forever. So I'm just going to sort of do this quickly. This might not be the very, very best example of this. But hey, it'll get the job done for now. And then I'm just going to blow these up from there. So yeah, that's sort of like an okay job done there. So now what we can do is, now that this is our symmetrical object and it's UV'd, what we can actually do is mirror it over and it'll share the exact same UV space. So what I can do is go to Mesh and Mirror. Let's see. Mirror World Object. I'm going to use the object and I want to mirror in the axis of, it is X, I believe. And apply, and there we go. I was just a little bit confused there because I never actually used the mirror options in 2017. So now, as you can see, we have the exact same shells, but they're exactly the same on top of each other. So if I move one shell, there should be one underneath of it, because this is not only the shell for this side, but it's also this side placed directly on top of each other. And that's how you can do it really easily. If you have something symmetrical like a face, or say perhaps you have two legs or something, you can just do one, mirror it over, and it'll have the exact same UV coordinates. So you can just do the one boot and then have it done on the other side. But essentially this is UVing at its most basic state. And then from here, what you can do, say you want a texture in Photoshop, you can go to, with your object selected, polygons, UV snapshot, and then say you want this to be a 1K texture, 1024 by 1024, and I can just save this to the desktop as test. And let's say we want this to be a JPEG, okay, and what that will actually do is it will export our UV shape, our coordinates like this, into a file that we can then draw under in Photoshop. And we can sort of import that texture back and it'll be perfectly mapped onto these polygons exactly how we want them to be. Also, this is great because now our actual OBJ or our object file that we export is actually going to have this integrated into the object file itself. Like the UVs is not only for texturing, but it's actually part of your object now. So whenever you export it or move it into another program, such as maybe Keyshot, Substance Painter, Marble Set Toolbag, anything like that, the Unreal Engine is going to be UV'd. Once it's UV'd for good, unless you change it, obviously. So obviously this is awesome because now we have this, we can texture it however we want to manually or using some digital painting softwares, and we can sort of import that right back in, and that's exactly how you do basic UVs, guys. So hopefully you guys did learn something. I know a lot of you guys out there have very intricate things that you've wanted me to teach you how to do UVs, but I thought it'd be a great idea to sort of do a basic UV tutorial before anything else. I looked up a lot of UV tutorials myself when I was learning, and I feel like a lot of them were way too advanced. I feel like this is a great way to sort of dive into the very basics of it. And we did talk about UVs briefly in my class, and I felt like a lot of my classmates really didn't understand it at the start, but that was exactly me, because I honestly couldn't wrap my head around UVs for the longest time. These people were running around like chickens with their head cut off, trying to understand what UVs were, and I'm just like, I was totally there myself. And this is sort of one of those more difficult things to wrap your head around for quite some time, but once you get it, you're going to be using it in pretty much all of your 3D models. It's absolutely necessary in professional work. So hopefully you guys did learn something. A like on this video would be amazing. Comment, like I said, what would you rather see next, a rendering tutorial or animation? I'd love to hear from you guys, and I hope you guys did learn something. Let me guys know what you're going to be using this on in the comments down below. Tweet me your stuff, as always. I love seeing it. But once again, guys, thank you so much for watching. My name has been Tie-Dye, and I will catch you in the next video. See ya.